At the Sultan's court, Vlad the Impaler became Vlad III's son, first to a false father, then to a new one. In 1444, Vlad's real father died in mysterious circumstances. Some say poisoned by his own mother, Queen Helena. Others whisper that he met a more violent end at the hands of his Hungarian captors. Either way, the throne of Wallachia was vacant, and Vlad's mother wasted no time in seizing it, making her youngest son the heir apparent. But the spoiled apple didn't fall far from the tree. Helena was cunning, ruthless, and utterly ambitious. She ruled as regent for Vlad the Impaler, and she did so with a firm iron fist. Her son was still in Ottoman territory. She was the dragon without a dragon son. As Vlad grew older in the Ottoman court, he excelled in everything they taught him, mastering their religion, customs, even their tongue. Yet the taste of freedom turned bitter. He lived in a gilded cage, and his spirit chafed against the bars. After 6 years of captivity, Vlad was ready to take back what was his by birthright. Or perhaps the Sultan's court had corrupted him more than he realized. In 1448, with the help of his mother, Vlad returned to Wallachia, only to find it in chaos. The Bayaz had overthrown his sister, his father's widow, and installed a puppet ruler. Vlad wasted no time in setting things right. He raised an army and marched on Targovest, the bloodlust in his veins and vengeance on his lips. Then came the siege of Targovest, a brutal 3-week ordeal during which Vlad's forces laid siege to the city. Once inside, he unleashed his fury. The disloyal Bayards were executed. The citizens suffered unspeakable atrocities, and Vlad's reputation as a merciless ruler began to spread like wildfire. You wanted to know the truth behind the legend. Here it is. Vlad the Impaler plunged Wallachia into darkness, and in the process, he became the stuff of nightmares. He ruled like a god over his people, dispensing justice as swift and merciless as death itself. We will tell you how Vlad the Impaler earned his infamous title, how he used blood as a sacrament, and how he horrified even his enemies with his brutality. If you can stomach the truth, stay tuned. They didn't break his body, they broke his soul. And somehow, that was worse. When Vlad the Impaler was handed over to the Ottoman Empire in 1442, he was just 11 years old, a boy torn from the cold forests of Wallachia and thrown into the golden prison of his enemies. He and his younger brother Radu were sent to the court of Sultan Murad II, a place where power and pleasure flowed like wine, but so did blood. To the Ottomans, these boys were not guests. They were living pledges, pawns in a game of empire. One false move by their father, and their heads would roll without ceremony. At first, the brothers were confined to the fortress of Ekrix in Anatolia. The cold stone walls were unforgiving. The guards spoke a language Vlad barely understood. The food was unfamiliar. Punishment was swift and brutal, and always for the smallest infraction. They were cut off from everything they had known, and no one cared if they cried. But Vlad didn't cry, while Radu wept. Vlad clenched his fists, while Radu adapted. Vlad observed. He watched how power moved, quiet, sharp, merciless. His brother Radu, with his soft features and quiet voice, eventually won favor with the Ottomans. He learned their language, their customs, their religion. He became a favorite of Prince Mehmed, the Sultan's son, the very boy who would one day become Mehmed the Conqueror. But Vlad resisted. He refused to bend. He refused to convert. And for that, they punished him. It began subtly. Colder cells, poorer food, longer hours in isolation. But resistance only fueled his captor's cruelty. Soon, the beatings began. Vlad was whipped until his back was a raw tapestry of scars. He was suspended by ropes, left hanging in the dark, bleeding. At times, he was starved until he hallucinated, saw his father's ghost in the corners of his cell. There were whispers, quiet ones, of more intimate abuses, though history dares not record them in detail. What's certain is that the boy they imprisoned did not remain a boy for long. He mutated into something cold, calculating, dangerous. In the Sultan's court, the young princes were often forced to witness executions, to be taught the nature of authority and its cost. Vlad watched men beheaded, burned, flayed. But one method struck him deeper than the rest: impalement. He watched as sharpened stakes, sometimes thick, sometimes thin, were driven through living men and women, slowly. Vlad the Impaler, Prince of Wallachia, watched as sharpened stakes, sometimes thick, sometimes thin, were driven through living captives, slowly, methodically. Sometimes through the stomach, sometimes through the back, and sometimes, with cruel precision, the executioners angled their work so the victim would linger, alive, for hours, even days, crying out, struggling, moving helplessly like an insect pinned for display. The message was always clear: this is what happens to those who defy us. Most boys would have turned away, collapsed in horror, but Vlad didn't blink. He stood still, silent, his eyes wide not in fear, but in recognition. There was something brutally logical about the ritual. Primitive, yes, but effective. It didn't just kill, it transformed death into theater. A stage where one body could speak louder than 1,000 soldiers. Vlad absorbed that lesson. The guards began to fear him not because he fought, but because he refused to break. When struck, he met his tormentor's gaze. When denied food, he saved his strength. When Radu begged for comfort, Vlad offered none. He was alone. He wanted it that way. In time, Radu converted to Islam and became Radu Bey. His soft nature, once a weakness, turned into a weapon. He charmed the Sultan's court. He dined with princes. He lived in luxury, while Vlad remained in shadow. That betrayal cut deeper than any lash. The brothers, who had once shared warmth in Transylvanian winters, were now divided by faith, power, and ambition. Vlad saw Radu's comfort as weakness. Radu saw Vlad's pride as madness, but madness was the only shield Vlad had. Through the years, Vlad absorbed Ottoman tactics, languages, and court politics, not to join them, but to one day destroy them. He studied maps. He noted the flaws in fortress walls. He learned how fear could rule more effectively than faith. He became a student of cruelty, and he remembered every scar, every insult, every moment of hunger. Every time he was forced to watch another man suffer, he stored those memories like weapons, sharpening them in silence, preparing for the day he would return to Wallachia. That day came sooner than expected. In 1447, news reached the Ottoman court that Vlad's father, Vlad II, Dracula, had been betrayed and murdered by the Hungarian-backed boyars. His eldest brother, Mircea, was captured, blinded with hot irons, and buried alive. That moment destroyed the last remnants of the boy Vlad had once been. He was now fatherless, brotherless, alone in a foreign land. And worse, he knew why it happened. The boyars, those arrogant nobles who played kingmaker in Wallachia, had turned on his father the moment his strength faltered. They saw Dracula not as a dragon, but as a dying wolf. And they struck. Vlad's hatred became absolute. It was no longer about justice. It was about cleansing. It's 1448, with the throne of Wallachia vacant, Sultan Murad sent Vlad, 17 years old, back to claim it, backed by a small Ottoman force. But this was no triumphant return. The land that had once known him as a child now looked at him as a stranger. His name carried whispers. His eyes carried darkness. He ruled for only a few months before being pushed out by rivals. His power was fragile, his enemies many, his reign uncertain, but it was a test. He had seen the throne, he had touched it, and now he would do whatever it took to take it back and keep it with iron and blood. His enemies had taught him that mercy was a lie, that trust was a rope for your own neck, that only through terror could order be secured. He returned to exile, yes, but he returned with vision. He had tasted betrayal. He had studied suffering. He had seen what impalement could do, not only to bodies, but to the soul of a nation. Vlad was no longer a child of dragons. He was the dragon himself. And when he returned to Wallachia again, the stakes would be waiting. Okay, everyone, let's talk about the brilliance of the Impaler series. Seriously, if you haven't read these books or watched the show, then you are missing out. Firstly, let's talk about how captivating this series is. From the very first page, you are hooked, and there's no denying that. Vlad, the main character, is one of the most intriguing and well-developed characters I have ever come across. The story is told from his point of view, which allows us to delve deep into his thoughts and feelings as he navigates through the complexities of his mission. What makes Vlad such a compelling character is his sheer willpower and determination to survive and thrive, despite being subjected to unimaginable horrors. His strength and resilience are truly admirable. The series paints a vivid picture of the brutal and unforgiving world that Vlad finds himself in. The action scenes are intense and well choreographed, leaving you on the edge of your seat. But it's not just the action that makes this series so captivating. The political intrigue is equally fascinating. Vlad's rise to power and his cunning strategies to outmaneuver his enemies are brilliantly executed. The series keeps you guessing until the very end. One of the things I admire most about this series is how it explores the complexities of human nature. The characters are multidimensional and their motivations are understandable, even if you don't agree with their actions. You can't help but feel empathy for them as they struggle with their inner demons and make difficult choices. The supporting characters are equally fascinating, each bringing their own unique perspective and adding depth to the story. The writing is top-notch. The author's ability to transport you to another time and place is truly remarkable. The historical details are meticulously researched, and the world building is immersive. You can almost feel the grime of the streets, hear the chatter of the marketplace, and smell the aroma of spices in the air. The author's attention to detail is evident in every page. Overall, the Impaler series is a must-read for anyone who enjoys historical fiction, fantasy, or just a good story. Quetting plot, unforgettable characters, and immersive writing. It is a series that will stay with you long after you finish reading it. Don't miss out on this epic tale of adventure, betrayal, and redemption. Pick up the first book in the series today and get ready to be captivated. Okay, trust me, you won't regret it. The first stake was a warning. The 100th was a message. But the 1000th, that was when people began to whisper that Vlad Țepeș was no longer a man, but a curse upon the earth. In the early years of his reign, once the boyards had been removed and the throne secured, Vlad turned his focus to the unrest festering within Wallachia. Petty thieves, lawless gangs, silent conspirators. So Vlad, order was not a virtue, it was a necessity. Without it, chaos would return. And he had not survived betrayal and imprisonment to be undone by corruption and indiscipline. So he enforced his justice. At first, the punishments were local. A merchant caught defrauding customers was publicly condemned. A village leader who allowed lawlessness to grow was removed with finality. Warnings were issued, then punishment followed, firm, visible, and unforgettable. The people began to understand that this was no ordinary prince. This was someone who believed that fear was more persuasive than law. Teens began to take shape. A noble woman accused of deceit faced royal judgment. When found guilty, her fate became the subject of hushed retellings in taverns and fields alike. Not because of its brutality, though it was severe, but because of its symbolism. Let all be diligent, the townspeople said afterward, repeating his words like a proverb. These acts weren't random. They were intentional. A dark code of discipline, written not with ink, but with example. He didn't just punish criminals. He redefined crime, honesty, idleness, disloyalty. To Vlad, these were not minor failings. They were threats to the very stability of his rule. And all threats had to be neutralized. He often rode through villages in disguise, dressed as a common traveler. He listened, observed. If he heard whispers of unrest or signs of disrespect, he remembered, and he returned with consequences. His chosen method of punishment soon became infamous: the stake. It wasn't the number of victims that shocked the world. It was the methodical way they were displayed. Every stake sent a message. Justice had a form now, and it was impossible to ignore. Over time, communities fell quiet, not because they were empty, but because no one dared speak carelessly. But perhaps the most chilling episode from this early purge was what became known behind closed doors as the Banquet of the Poor. Reports had reached Vlad that cities were being overwhelmed by beggars and the sick, straining resources and risking the spread of disease. So he summoned them to a great hall. There they were fed, given warmth, shelter, and then the hall was sealed. What happened next is still debated. Some say it was a fire. Others say it was a symbolic act meant to make a brutal point. But the result was the same. None survived. When asked why, Vlad is said to have answered, they would be of no use to themselves or to others or to the world. To some, it was a cleansing. To others, an unspeakable cruelty. Either way, few ever sought alms again under his rule. But Vlad's punishments were not limited to the vulnerable. His real hatred was reserved for betrayal. Local governors who grew too powerful quietly disappeared. Religious leaders who publicly questioned his harsh governance found their authority revoked or worse. Even his foreign guests were not exempt. One tale describes a noble who refused to remove his headwear in Vlad's presence. What followed was a punishment so grotesque that it passed into legend as a cautionary tale about pride and etiquette. Kid, no trials, no debates, only finality. But Vlad didn't hide these actions. He broadcasted them. Foreign merchants saw the aftermath. Ambassadors carried the rumors home. And nobles abroad began to wonder what might happen should they cross the border into Wallachia. The fear became international. Saxon traders from Transylvania, once dismissive of Wallachian politics, began writing home with reports of horrific displays, roads lined with victims, villages emptied, and punishments too grim to repeat in full. In one account, an entire village was found emptied, with every home abandoned. Single note had been left behind. They harbored traitors. Whether this was fact or fiction, it spread like wildfire. And behind the horror lay a kind of genius. This wasn't madness, it was control. Vlad had realized that the world didn't respect treaties. It didn't respect laws. It respected one thing: consequence. So he built a kingdom where disobedience had a price. And that price was steep. To outsiders, he was a tyrant, a demon, madman. But to those who lived under his rule, those who obeyed, he was something else entirely. Voyevode, ruler, protector. Because under Vlad's rule, the roads were safe. Merchants could travel without fear of bandits. Thieves could sleep knowing they would not be taxed into starvation. 'Cause in Vlad's Wallachia, the law was not a book. It was a man. And he stood in his tower, cloaked in silence and fire, whispering, "Obey or vanish." You ever meet a guy that just by the way he walks, the way he talks, you just know not to mess with him? You see some dudes getting loud and you instantly regret being around them. Some people carry themselves with such quiet power that their presence alone stops you in your tracks. Vlad the Impaler was like that times infinity. One story about him has stuck with me. There was this one time that Vlad had to send a letter to the king of Hungary, Matthias Corvinus, asking him to return some holy relics that Hungary had stolen from Wallachia. Now, Matthias was kind of like the cool big brother. Cad always got what he wanted, because he was bigger and meaner than everyone else. But even he took a step back when he heard from Vlad. See, Vlad didn't beg or plead in his letter. He didn't try to guilt-trip the king or remind him of their supposed friendship. No, Vlad just laid out the facts. Here's what you stole. Here's why we want it back. Here's what will happen if you don't return it. And then he listed the names and value of the items stolen, basically saying, hey, if you don't give these things back, we re-gonna assume you re a thief, and we re-gonna tell everyone you re a thief unless you want us to. And wouldn't you know it, the relics just magically reappeared in Wallachia a few days later. See, Vlad understood something that most leaders didn't. Fear wasn't just chaos. It was a method, one that could get results faster than any army ever could. In fact, Vlad rarely drew his sword during his entire reign. Instead, he built a reputation so terrifying that his enemies often fell apart before he even had to lift a finger. There were no grand battles under Vlad the Impaler. There was peace, a peace that echoed across Europe. Look at this modern map of Romania. Imagine how crazy it is that this dude struck fear into the hearts of people across this entire region, not just in Wallachia, but in Hungary, Transylvania, Bulgaria, Moldova, even the Ottoman Empire. How do you strike that much fear? Well, you become the embodiment of consequences. When armies invaded his land, they didn't find resistance. They found silence. Silent fields, silent villages, silent forests. Sometimes they'd find a dead horse or a severed head left as a warning. They never found Vlad, but they felt his presence everywhere, like a ghost haunting the battlefield. That's how you make a name for yourself when you're not trying to be famous. You just do what you have to do and let the results speak for themselves. It wasn't just a battlefield. It was a monument, cathedral built from fear itself. No one knows exactly how many stakes were raised that summer. In the spring of 1462, the Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II decided that Vlad Țepeș had become more than a regional nuisance. Țepeș was a threat, a ruler who resisted tribute, defied emissaries, and challenged the empire's will. So Mehmed gathered a massive force, an army of over 100,000 men supported by siege, engines, cavalry, and war galleys on the Danube. They would march into Wallachia, crush Vlad, and end his reign once and for all. But Vlad had no intention of meeting them in open battle. He knew their numbers were too great, their weapons too many, their resolve too strong. So instead, he turned to the only weapon that had never failed him: fear. He retreated from the advancing army, scorching the earth behind him. Wells were poisoned, crops destroyed, villages emptied, and all along the roads leading to the capital of Targvist, his men worked tirelessly. Stakes were raised, silent warnings were left behind. When Mehmed's army finally approached the outskirts of Targvist, they expected a siege. What they found, instead, broke their spirit. The valley before the city had been transformed into a vast spectacle, an open-air warning where every figure told a story. Some bore signs of treason. Others carried messages carved into wood. This is what happens to invaders. The Ottomans, hardened by war, no strangers to violence, stopped in their tracks. Even Mehmed himself, the conqueror of Constantinople, was visibly shaken. Chroniclers say he remained silent for nearly an hour, staring at what Vlad had created. He had never seen war used this way, not as combat, not even as conquest, but as pure psychological devastation. The soldiers refused to advance. Some deserted in the night. Others begged for permission to withdraw. And Mehmed, faced with the prospect of fighting a ruler who turned terror into strategy, gave the order: retreat. The most powerful empire in the world turned back. Vlad had defeated them without raising a sword. But the Forest of the Impaled was not just a tactical victory. It was a manifesto, a declaration of how Vlad saw the world. To him, Fear was not simply a tool. It was a message board, a theater, a form of communication louder than diplomacy, clearer than treaties. Okay? And once he realized the power of this spectacle, he used it again and again. In later years, merchants who defied his tariffs, village leaders who betrayed him, even emissaries who arrived unprepared for his court, all were confronted with similar displays. No place was safe. No one was immune. In the forest, it was never truly gone, because even after the bodies decayed, the stakes remained weathered, splintered, but still standing, reminders to anyone who dared enter that this was Vlad's kingdom. The legends began to spread. In Germany, pamphlets depicted him as a monstrous tyrant. In Russia, he was praised as a holy avenger. In Hungary, stories painted him as a cruel oppressor. In the Ottoman Empire, his name was spoken in whispers. And in Wallachia, the people, caught between reverence and horror, called him what he had always been, Țepeș, the Impaler, the ruler who turned fear into a weapon sharper than any blade. The forest of the impaled had scared off an empire. But Vlad knew something far more dangerous was coming. Not foreign armies, not swords, but whispers. Whispers from within his own court. He had ruled with terror, yes, but terror is a double-edged blade, keeps enemies at bay, but it also breeds paranoia. And in Wallachia, betrayal was not a matter of if, it was a matter of when. The boyards he had spared were not grateful. He had bought their silence, yes, but they were waiting for a stumble, sign of weakness, a crack in the armor of the dragon. And abroad, Matthias Corvinus, the king of Hungary Vlad's supposed Christianella, began to reconsider his loyalty. Vlad's methods were becoming difficult to justify in the eyes of Europe. Ambassadors from the Holy Roman Empire brought with them horrifying stories, forests of corpses, rivers red with blood, and peasants impaled for crimes as small as stealing bread. The church looked too hungry for action. And Corvinus, the politician, began to see Vlad as a liability. Meanwhile, back in Wallachia, Vlad's reign was growing increasingly paranoid. He trusted no one, not his advisors, not his servants, not even his own guards. He began rotating soldiers constantly. Anyone who served him too long was either disappeared or replaced. He changed the locations of his sleeping quarters each night. Banned closed doors in his court. Even laughter was viewed with suspicion. What were they laughing at? Who had told the joke? Was the joke about him? Vlad had become a specter in his own castle, drifting from room to room with daggers hidden beneath his robes, his eyes that never blinked, and ears tuned to silence more than words. Then came the letters. They were discovered by one of Vlad's spy secret correspondences between the boyards and the Hungarians. The nobles had grown weary of Vlad's rule. The fear that once kept them silent had now turned to desperation. They wanted him gone, and they had a plan. In the dead of night, they would open the gates of Targovec to Hungarian troops who would seize Vlad and install a more reasonable ruler. The moment Vlad learned of the plot, something snapped. He summoned every boyar still alive and held a special council. The nobles arrived, nervous but masked in smiles. They bowed. They praised his victories. They lied. And Vlad listened. He nodded. He smiled. He poured them wine. And then, without changing his tone, without raising his voice, he spoke. I know your letters. I know your plans. I know your treachery. They froze. Some tried to speak. Others collapsed to their knees. One tried to flee, but the guards were already behind him, swords drawn. That night, over 200 nobles were impaled just outside the city walls. Vlad personally oversaw the placement of each stake. He ordered the taller ones for the richer boyars, shorter ones for their sons. A special crooked stake was made for one noble who had mocked Vlad's mother. It spiraled through the gut before exiting the mouth. The executions lasted 3 days. And during it all, Vlad did not eat. He didn't sleep. He simply watched, stone-faced, unblinking. and when it was done, he restructured his entire government. The noble class was replaced with commoners. Soldiers and foreigners, men, loyal not to bloodlines, but to fear, loyal to him. But the internal threats didn't stop. Not long after, he discovered a plot among his own guards. A handful of soldiers had been bribed to poison his food. They were tortured, interrogated, then impaled inside the castle walls so he could look upon them daily as he dined. Even his mistresses were not exempt. One woman, suspected of passing information to Hungarian spies, was summoned to Vlad's chambers. He embraced her, kissed her, then stabbed her through the heart with a golden dagger, whispering, "Even love can rot." The castle grew quieter. Visitors became rarer. Vlad's own family stopped writing. He was no longer just feared. He was isolated. And that, perhaps, was his greatest weakness. Because outside his walls, the world was shifting. Matthias Corvinus, pressured by the Pope and eager to maintain alliances, began to act. He denounced Vlad's behavior publicly and in secret. He supported Vlad's brother, Radovan, the soft child of Ottoman captivity, now a polished diplomat and military commander. The Ottomans, too, saw an opportunity. They offered Radu their full support, promising him the Wallachian throne in exchange for loyalty. In 1462, while Vlad prepared for another campaign against Turkish incursions, Radu crossed the border with an Ottoman-backed force. And for the first time, Vlad found himself abandoned. The people, broken and afraid, did not rise to defend him. The nobles who remained remembered the stakes. The soldiers hesitated, and Vlad, he fled, not in disgrace, but in silence. He escaped north into Hungarian territory, seeking protection from Matthias Corvinus. But Corvinus had already made his choice. Vlad was arrested, his titles revoked, his freedom stolen. Just like that, the Impaler became a prisoner once more, not in a Turkish dungeon, this time, but in the European cell walls that echoed with Latin prayers instead of Arabic chants. And the stakes, they remained in the ground, swaying gently in the wind, waiting for their master to return. They had chained his body, but they could never chain his will. Vlad, the Impaler, Prince of Wallachia, and a name that carried fear across continents, had fallen. Not to swords or rebellion, but to politics. He was no longer on the battlefield, but within the cold stone walls of a European fortress. His captor, Matthias Corvinus, King of Hungary, once an ally, now a cautious observer, wary of the growing controversy surrounding Vlad's reign. To the outside world, Corvinus claimed his hands were tied. Vlad's rule had become too controversial. Whispers of excessive cruelty had spread across borders. It was easier to silence him quietly than confront him directly. And so, Vlad became a prisoner, not broken, just ... waiting. 12 years passed, while most would have faded into obscurity or despair. Vlad remained vigilant. He read, he observed, he listened, even locked away. His presence unsettled those around him. Guards spoke in hushed tones. Visitors avoided eye contact. Some claimed he had grown even more calculating. Strange rumors emerged that he spoke to no one but himself, that he spent hours gazing out his window, unmoving, that he was simply waiting for the world to change. And it did. By the early 1470s, the Ottoman Empire, long a dominant force, began pushing deeper into the Balkans once again. Wallachia, under Vlad's brother Radu, grew unstable. Radu passed in 1475 under mysterious circumstances. And suddenly, Wallachia had no ruler. The nobles who once feared Vlad began to reconsider. Say what you will about his methods, he had kept the borders safe. He had ruled with strength, and strength, now more than ever, was needed. A request was made to King Corvinus, release Vlad. Let him return under guidance. Of course, Corvinus, reluctant but practical, agreed, and in 1476, Vlad was freed. He did not return as the same man who had ruled before. He was older, colder, sharper. He returned to Wallachia, not with a vast army, but with a purpose: to reclaim control. His return was swift and precise. Those who had worked against him were quietly removed from power. Some were exiled, others disappeared from public view. His presence alone was enough to restore a sense of discipline. But this new reign was different. The political situation was more fragile. The Ottoman Empire was watching closely. Tensions rose. Small attacks began along the borders. And Vlad responded decisively, but now with international eyes watching his every move. His support among the nobles wavered. Alliances shifted like sand, and enemies gathered in the shadows. By December of 1476, the final blow arrived. The details of his death are debated to this day. Some say he fell in battle. Others claim it was an ambush orchestrated from within. There are even accounts suggesting mistaken identity, tragic confusion on the battlefield. What is certain is this: Vlad the Impaler died, and his death marked the end of an era. His body was lost to time, but his head, according to many chroniclers, was sent to the Ottoman court as proof of his demise. It was the final act in a lifetime of symbolism, the end of a man who had once ruled through fear, precision, and strategy. Wallachia, now silent, felt the absence. Though he had ruled with an iron grip, many quietly admitted that life had been more secure under his reign. The roads were safer. The borders held strong. Order, harsh as it was, had existed. In the wake of his death, stories spread like wildfire. Some called him a monster, others a savior. Some whispered that he had become something more: a myth, a symbol, a legend. It's called many names: a tyrant, a protector, a relic of a darker time. But perhaps the truth is simpler. Vlad the Impaler was a ruler forged by betrayal, tested by conflict, and remembered not for kindness, but for clarity. His justice was absolute, his methods unforgettable. To him, order was not passive. It was something built, enforced, and guarded. And though his time had ended, his story had just begun, retold for centuries, reimagined by poets, feared by generations. Not because he lived forever, but because the idea of him never died. Vlad's head had rotted, but his legend was just beginning to breathe. The year was 1476. The Impaler's corpse lay somewhere in the dirt of Wallachia, lost, mutilated, or secretly buried by those still loyal to him. His severed head, on the other hand, hung on a Turkish pike just outside the gates of Istanbul. Flies buzzed around it like carrion priests. The Sultan himself walked past it every day, not to mock it, but to remember. Because no matter what anyone said, Vlad Țepeș had stopped him once. Not with an army, but with terror so refined it became almost divine. And that was the real power of Vlad. Death didn't silence him. It amplified him. In the years after his execution, stories about the Impaler began to spread across Europe faster than horses, deeper than swords. They passed from merchant to merchant, from monk to noble. And as they passed, they twisted. One tale became 10. 10 became 100. The truth dissolved, and all that remained was myth. The Germans, ever fond of printed pamphlets and grim morality tales, began publishing lurid woodcuts of Vlad. They showed him dining among forests of corpses, sipping blood from golden goblets, laughing as infants were boiled alive. In one account, he was described as a demon clad in flesh, whose soul was sewn with needles, whose heart beat only when blood flowed. Other stories claimed he kept a library of deathware. Every corpse told a tale, and every stake bore a name. And through it all, one word began to emerge: a name, a title: curse, Dracula. To the Romanians, Dracula simply meant son of the dragon, a reference to Vlad's father, Vlad to Dracula, named for his membership in the chivalric Order of the Dragon. But to the rest of Europe especially, the terrified Western name took on a darker hue. It wasn't just about dragons anymore. It was about the devil. Dracul in Romanian also meant demon, and so Dracula became not a lineage, but a sentence. So Vlad the Impaler became Vlad the Undead, a creature who did not die, but waited, who drank not just blood, but souls. This wasn't accidental. Centuries later, in the 19th century, an Irish writer named Bram Stoker would dig through archives and find references to this medieval tyrant. The man who impaled armies, who burned the poor, who used fear as architecture. Stoker was already crafting a story of gothic horror centered around an immortal predator from the east. When he found the name Dracula, the pages stopped turning. The decision was made. And so the historical, Vlad flawed, brutal, political, was reborn in fiction as Count Dracula, the aristocrat vampire who drinks the blood of innocents and sleeps in a coffin lined with native soil. It was poetic, because Vlad never actually needed fangs, only a message. And in the end, that message outlived him. Even today, tourists flock to the Carpathian Mountains in search of Dracula's castle. Although Vlad never actually lived there, they visit the ruins of Punari, where Vlad did rule perched high on a mountain, his path lined with over 1,400 steps. They buy merchandise, they take photographs, they smile, but if they stand still long enough, if they let the wind rise and the sun fall, they might feel something else. The silence of judgment, the shadow of stakes, the echo of a man who made death a language. Historians debate him to this day. Some call him a genius strategist, a nationalist hero who stood against the might of the Ottomans with nothing but iron will. Others name him a psychopath, a sadist whose mind was so broken by childhood trauma that it could only see peace through pain. But maybe both are true. Maybe Vlad was what the world deserved in that moment. Not a saint, not a savior, but a reminder that evil doesn't always wear horns. Sometimes it wears a crown. And sometimes that evil doesn't vanish. It waits, it transforms, it bleeds into the soil, and grows fangs, because history doesn't die, it only sharpens. And Vlad the Impaler is still watching.